Good morning. Hope you're all having a wonderful morning so far. So, my conversion story, if you will, is nothing especially exciting. And sometimes I mourn that fact. I grew up in the church in my grandfather was a minister in the church for a long time. His brothers, my uncles were. My mom and my dad, they took me to church every week and to church events. And so at a young age, I got baptized by my grandfather, which was very special to me. But that I might have changed, but life didn't really... nothing, there was no exciting, drastic change. When I tell my testimony to people, it's nothing super exciting, and sometimes I get jealous when I hear some people's just really radical, exciting conversion stories, You hear, now I wouldn't want to be one, but you hear about serial killers becoming Christians. That's a huge change. Or gang members, One of my best friends who is a minister in the church now, and he at one point was part of a gang. That was a huge change. Or you hear about, Muslims over in the Middle East. They have a dream or a vision of Jesus, and then, they start to read their Bible and stuff, and they become Christians. And these are some exciting stories, and sometimes I'm a little jealous when I tell my testimony, For those of you who have grown up in the church, have you ever thought that way at some point in your life? I wish my story was a little more exciting. Why didn't I get a vision or some cool event? Now, some of you have had some interesting things happen, and that's, great for you. Some people here didn't grow up in the church. And there was a bigger change in their lives. Some people didn't grow up going to church. They didn't have anything God-related in their lives, and they ended up becoming followers of Jesus, and it was a big change for them. And that's amazing, and that's fantastic, and I'm so happy for you. The first thing I want to say here, though, is God celebrates everyone being saved. Amen. It does not matter how you got there. He is happy that it happened. But there is one particular story in the Bible, one person's conversion, that I'm a little bit jealous of. It's pretty exciting. Paul's. And we're going to talk about it a little bit today, and you're going to see, that would have been really neat. You're coming face to face with Jesus like that. And we're going to talk about that this week, because last week we started talking about Galatians, and we looked at the greeting and the opening thoughts, and the sort of introduction to his letter, and now we're in a new section, which is what Paul starts what you could almost call an extended autobiographical section here. It runs from Galatians 1:11 all the way through 2:21. And within it are three main sections, almost you could call them snapshots from his life, that relate to the issues the church in Galatia is facing. And Paul uses these snapshots to help people understand his ministry, message, and the gospel he preaches. And with a sort of surface reading, we might think, as we look at this going forward, that Paul's defending his apostleship, or his ministry, or his message. And yes, that's part of it, but the true purpose is to defend the gospel. He is defending specifically the gospel that he preached. And he starts off his letter by telling people, if anyone tells you a gospel different than the one I preached to you, different than the one that you received, let them be cursed. Even if an angel shows up, cursed. Strong words about being under God's judgment. He is far more interested in defending the gospel than himself. And so in these snapshots, he does defend his position a little bit, but for the sake of defending the gospel. And so this brings us to sort of his first snapshot, which is about his conversion and his former way of life. And he talks about this and how it relates to the gospel message that he shares. And so we're gonna start by looking at verses 11 through 12. And if you want to know what he's referencing, you can flip back and forth between this and Acts chapter 9. But he says, "For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel preached by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source, and I was not taught it, but it came by a revelation of Jesus Christ." You know, when he starts out like that, "For I want you to know," that "for," anywhere in the Bible, shows that it connects with whatever came previously. And as I said previously, he says, you know, the gospel I preach to you is the real one. Don't accept anything else. Right? And so he's sort of explaining that now and saying, listen, the gospel that I preach to you, the one that I said is the true gospel that you need to listen to, it's not by me or any other human. You know, this didn't come from my imagination. It's got nothing to do with my desire to please people or anything like that. It is not from people. In verse 12, he explains, you know, it came by a revelation of Jesus Christ. Again, this isn't some oral tradition or teaching that I received from someone. I received this directly from Jesus. And so let's take a quick aside here and talk about what the message was that he's defending. You know, at the heart of the letter to the Galatians is the idea that Gentiles can come into the people of God as Gentiles. They don't have to get circumcised. They don't have to become Jews. And this is a huge component of the gospel of Jesus Christ that Paul preaches. Gentiles are co-heirs and equals with Jews in Christ. They are just as legitimate and equal in Christ. And so Paul is making it clear that this freedom of Gentiles to come in as Gentiles under Jesus that he is preaching is not something he has made up. He received it from Jesus Christ. You know, we all know that story. Acts chapter 9, he's traveling down the road to Damascus to hunt down Christians. And he meets Jesus. And his entire life is upended. It is radically changed. And in that encounter, Jesus even says, I am going to send you far away to the Gentiles. And Jesus wants the Gentiles to come into the family, just as the prophets foretold. And Paul preached that gospel to the Gentiles. And so then he moves forward and says, and explains even more in verses 13 through 17. For you have heard about my former way of life in Judaism. I intensely persecuted God's church, and I tried to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many contemporaries among my people because I was extremely zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who from my mother's womb set me apart and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I could preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. I did not go to Jerusalem to those who had become apostles before me. Instead, I went to Arabia and came back to Damascus. And so he starts in right away and says, you know about my former way of life. Now, we're not sure how they know. Maybe he told them. Maybe someone else told them. Either way, he's assuming that they know about his former way of life and the fact that he intensely persecuted God's church and tried to destroy it. You know, as the persecution arose in the years following the advent of the church and it beginning to grow in Jerusalem, Paul took it upon himself in the wake of Stephen's stoning to sort of, almost become the chief persecutor of the church and really hunt down the people and destroy it and stamp out the gospel message. He says, in verse 14, I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries because I was extremely zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. What he's saying here is, he was an up-and-comer in the Jewish elite in Jerusalem of his day. He was studying under the preeminent rabbi of the day named Gamaliel. If you got to study under him, you were special. You got to study with the best of the best. This would be like today trying to study science or physics under Stephen Hawking or something, right? Like this is special. To the point where when Gamaliel himself died, people started to say in the surrounding countryside that the glory of the law had departed. They held him in high esteem. He was revered that much, and he was Paul's teacher, which would have meant Paul was looked upon, very, very favorably. He was also connected to the Sanhedrin and other Jewish elite in some way. People would have looked at Paul as a young man, and they would have said, now there is a righteous man. There is a faithful Jew. There's a God-fearing Jew. That's the kind of young man that I want my kids to be like. And he says in verse 15, I had all that going for me, but then God, who from my mother's womb set me apart and called me by his grace, he was pleased to reveal his Son. That changed everything. But when he says, from my mother's womb, there's so much, there's debate everywhere about what this means. Is this a Calvinist thing? Is this something else? What really matters here is that phrase recalls certain things like some of the prophets in the Old Testament, like Jeremiah, who was said to have been set apart in his mother's womb, or like John the Baptist in our Christian walk, who was set apart in his mother's womb, basically. It's sort of connecting to these prophetic ministries, God has chosen Paul and set him aside. And Paul was making it clear, I was advancing in Judaism. I was happy with my life. This was not my idea. This was God's idea. This was God's choice. He wanted me, and he called me, and he says, you know what? It is a gift of grace. He says he called me by his grace. He views his ministry, even with all of the suffering it causes him, as an actual gift of grace from God. Isn't that quite the standard? How many of us view our opportunities to serve Jesus as an actual gift from God? Something to keep in mind. Then in verses 16 through 17, he continues and says, when this happened, I did not immediately consult with anyone. I did not go up to Jerusalem to those who become apostles before me. Instead, I went to Arabia and came back to Damascus. He didn't consult anybody. He didn't go, oh man, I got to get confirmation on this. I got to talk to these people and try to figure this out. He says, God called me to be an apostle, and I didn't rush back to Jerusalem because I was already in Damascus. And so he just, he gets to work. Verse 18 says, he didn't go back to Jerusalem for 3 years. He just immediately started preaching. Acts 9. He meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, and then he is led into Damascus blinded. He fasts and prays for 3 days, and Ananias is sent to tell Paul the gospel, to heal him, to baptize him, and Paul immediately dives in and starts preaching. Now remember Paul's education for a second. he knew the Old Testament really, really well. He knew the teachings about the Messiah, but up until now, he just couldn't see how Jesus fit into it. But now that he's met him and sees that Jesus is alive, it's become obvious to him, okay, Jesus is the Messiah. And so I can imagine him sitting there for 3 days, praying and fasting, blind, going over everything he knows about the Old Testament, and that Jesus is the Messiah, and trying to piece it together. I mean, that's what I would be doing. That's what I think any of us would be doing. And so after 3 days, Ananias comes and he fills in what he needs to know. It says he tells him the gospel, and then Paul is baptized. He receives the Holy Spirit. It is all clear to him now. It's all come together, and he just rushes out. He starts teaching Jesus is the Messiah. And so Paul says, at some point during all these 3 years, he went to Arabia. Acts doesn't really mention that little trip, so we don't know a whole lot about it, but we know it happened sometime during those 3 years, and a little bit of geography will actually help us with this. Damascus was about 130 miles north of Jerusalem, and we generally think of as Arabia as somewhat southeast of that. What's important is when we look at the first century maps, the northern border of Arabia basically backed right up against the eastern wall of Damascus. They were so closely connected that the Arabian king had an official representative with an office in Damascus. They were that well connected. In fact, that person, that official, and the king of Arabia at the time are mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11 and being involved in the plot to kill Paul in Damascus. And so it would have been easy enough at any time during those 3 years for Paul to basically just walk out the gates a few feet and be considered in Arabia and start teaching out there. So he didn't necessarily have to make a huge journey. It was still relatively in the area. He spent 3 years there. At some point he goes outside to the surrounding area of Arabia, goes back into Damascus, and then he continues in verses 18 through 20. Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to get to know Cephas, and I stayed with him 15 days. But I didn't see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. I declare in the sight of God, I am not lying in what I write to you. A lot of us probably know, but maybe some of us don't. Cephas is the Apostle Peter. Cephas is his Aramaic name. Peter means rock. Cephas also means rock. These were the names given to him by Jesus. So Paul says he didn't see any other apostles other than Peter and James. Maybe the other apostles were out preaching. Probably. Who knows? He didn't see them. But he says, even his first visit to Jerusalem after 3 years was really short. It was only 15 days. And his point here is really, I didn't have much of a connection to the other apostles. And so this is back to that, listening to the one end of the conversation. And what are these Judaizers saying and trying to do to criticize him? And from what we looked at last week, it looks like they are claiming that they have the authority of the apostles, and they are also telling the church that Paul is subservient to the apostles as well. He's under their authority. He has to listen to what they say, to what we're delivering. And Paul's like, well, actually, no. I was commissioned by Jesus, and I preached for 3 years before I even met an apostle. I am not subservient to them. Even when I did come to Jerusalem, it was only for 15 days, and I only met 2 of them. Right? I serve Jesus. I answer to Jesus. And so then he says in verse 20, he wants to assure the Galatians, he's telling the truth here. And he says, I declare in the sight of God, I am not lying to you. regardless of what you hear, regardless of what spin has put on this story, this is the way it actually played out. This is what happened to me. And then after being in Jerusalem for only 2 weeks, I went away again to start preaching. And then he says in verses 21, he continues, even afterwards, I went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia. What's interesting here is the main city in Cilicia was Tarsus, the city Paul grew up in. He basically went home to start preaching and telling everybody, like, hey guys, you got to listen to this. These are people he cares about. He wants them to know the gospel. And then in verse 22, he continues along this theme and says, during that time, I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea. Judea is the province around Jerusalem. He says, I was still unknown by sight in the churches of Jerusalem and the surrounding towns of Jerusalem. They didn't know me. I didn't know them. I went to the Gentiles. I had virtually no connection with them. I did not get my gospel from them. I wasn't taught it by them. Again, I am not under their authority. I was commissioned by Jesus, and that is the whole point. He's like, this gospel that I preached to you, I received from Jesus, and that is why you need to trust this gospel alone. And he says in verse 23, these people, all they kept hearing was, he who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith that he once tried to destroy. So Paul's initial connection with the Jerusalem church was very limited, and yet they start praising God because Paul was preaching the gospel that he once tried to destroy. And that's sort of the first snapshot in Paul's autobiographical section, where he's defending his message and ministry for the sake of defending the gospel. Verse 24, it just finishes, they glorified God because of me. Now, after a section like that, sometimes application can be a little bit difficult, right? There's no sort of imperative here. We're told Paul's story, his testimony. We're told a specific version of his story for the purposes of addressing the issues in Galatia. There's no specific call to action in this text for us today, is there? So how do you handle narrative texts like that don't really have any imperatives or commands or direct calls to action? Well, I think ultimately you do that by at least looking at the purpose of the text and maybe some of the theological content in there. So what is the purpose of this text? The purpose is for Paul to say, the gospel I preached is the gospel Jesus wanted me to preach. It is the true and trustworthy gospel. That's the purpose here, and that's the whole point. It's not just his own human reflections or oral tradition. He met Jesus on the Damascus Road, it changed his life, and he's delivering that message. And so we can know what Paul says is trustworthy. So that's the first thing we should take from this. Paul was a trustworthy teacher. And then a little bit of reflection on what Paul does and why he does it is important. There's many times that we've seen and will continue to see that Paul comes under attack in his ministry. There are places in his letters where he doesn't defend himself. We see that in Philippians chapter 1, where Paul says they're preaching the gospel and they're doing it because they're trying to make his life miserable. But he doesn't defend himself. He doesn't attack them or anything. And it's because he says they're preaching the gospel. They're preaching the real gospel. I don't care what they say about me. I care that the gospel is being preached. But in Galatians, they are preaching a false gospel, and so he gets into a vigorous defense of himself, his ministry, message, all for defending the gospel. And so the principle here is, I think, if it doesn't affect the gospel, you don't need to get defensive. You can let God defend you if He decides to do it. Because, sometimes getting defensive will actually hurt the gospel, depending how you go about it. There are times when we don't need to defend ourselves, even if people are attacking us verbally and saying things about us, because we don't want to cause problems for the gospel. That is Paul's greatest concern, the well-being of the gospel and the truth of the gospel. And so he's going to refrain from defending himself if it's not going to hinder the gospel. But he will defend himself if in not doing so it is going to hinder the gospel, or in some way put a negative light on the gospel. Then he will defend himself. His choice to defend himself or not defend himself is completely motivated by what is best for the gospel. That is a really important principle for us, I think. Whether we're in ministry or not, whether we're engaged in volunteer activity or not, we need to primarily think of our life as so caught up with the gospel that that's what we care about. And we don't necessarily need to defend ourselves. We can let God do that. Years ago, I went on a missions trip to Germany, which was a fun experience, and I can tell you about that sometime if you want. But there was some friction in our team that went. And the team leader took me aside at one point, and I was kind of an insecure guy, and if I thought there was any sort of criticism leveled at me, even when there usually wasn't, I'd get defensive. And that often meant being emotional, maybe lashing out, saying not the kindest things. And he took me aside and he said, in situations like that, you don't need to defend yourself. One, defending yourself the way you are is giving a worse impression. And two, if God thinks you need to be defended, He is more than capable of defending you. And so I share that because, I want you to learn from it. I think it's an important lesson. But the other lesson is, if it does affect or hinder the gospel, then you absolutely have to speak up.
Amen.
If not defending ourselves is going to hinder the gospel or shame it or slander it, then we have to defend ourselves in such a way that we're actually defending the gospel, because we care more about the gospel than ourselves. And finally, I want to say, follow Paul's example and view any chance you have to serve as a gift from God, not a burden. I know sometimes when we have these opportunities to serve, it's possible to sort of think in your back of your head, I have to do this. People expect this of me. It's required, whatnot. And it becomes a bit of a burden. But let's try to think of it more as, I get to do this. I get to serve God and to serve my family in some way. And this is such a gift from God. I think if we took these three lessons to heart, we would see changes in our own lives. We would become less defensive and insecure. We would become so wrapped up and confident in the gospel that we just worry about ourselves less and about God and the gospel and our brothers and sisters more. And so my closing words, my encouragement in light of all of that is just fall in love with and get so wrapped up in the gospel that everything else pales in comparison. Get wrapped up in the gospel.